The primary purpose of this podcast is to educate and inform. The views, information, or opinions expressed by hosts or guests are their own. Neither the show nor any of its content should be construed as investment advice or as a recommendation to buy or sell any particular security. Security-specific information shared on this podcast should not be relied upon as a basis for your own investment decisions. Be sure to do your own research. The podcast hosts and participants may have a position in the securities mentioned personally through sub-accounts and/or through separate funds and may change their holdings at any time.
Welcome to This Week in Intelligent Investing, where we examine timely and timeless investing topics to help you become a better investor. Enjoy authentic, unscripted discussion featuring Phil Ordway, Elliot Turner, and other thought-leading investors, brought to you by MOI Global. And now, here's your host, John Mihaljevic.
Well, thank you, everybody, for joining me today. We have a very, very special guest today. Roger Lowenstein is joining us. I've been a big fan of his books for a long time, and he and I have been corresponding via email for years now. And we wanted to time this with the release of his new book, Ways and Means, Lincoln and his cabinet and the financing of the Civil War. We're going to spend most of our time talking about that. But by way of introduction, for anyone who's not familiar with his work, he was at the Wall Street Journal for over a decade, and then wrote a book that it was certainly an important one in my life, Buffett, The Making of an American Capitalist. And just as a quick digression, I was actually a business school student, and I'd done a few years of banking and didn't know anything about anything and was kind of wandering in the forest, lonely and dark and clueless, and read that book one summer at a disastrous summer internship. And it literally was the cartoon light bulb going off. The scales fell from my eyes and I had instant clarity as to what I wanted to do the rest of my life. And I still think it's one of the best business books I've ever read on any subject. And I still think it's one of the defining business biographies in the whole subject. So Roger, thank you for doing that. I really appreciate that book. It's been fantastic for me.
Labor of love. Thanks, Phil.
And then you've also written another all-time classic, When Genius Failed, The Rise and Fall of Long-Term Capital Management. And I believe this is now your seventh book, if I counted correctly. We have Origins of the Crash, The Great Bubble and Its Undoing in 2004, While America Aged, How Pension Debts Ruined GM, among other things, in 2008, The End of Wall Street in 2010, America's Bank, The Epic Struggle to Create the Fed in 2015, and now Ways and Means. So I guess one of the questions I wanted to ask just quickly off the top is, you wrote such an amazing biography, and then you wrote kind of a business biography with the Buffett and LTCM books, but then you've kind of launched into this arc as a very serious historian and taking on these big, wide-ranging projects. Was that by design, or did you just kind of stumble into that by personal interest?
Well, it was by interest. I hope it wasn't a stumble, but I always had an interest in history. If you even read the more contemporary books, say the Buffett book or the LTCM, I always tried to cram as much history and historical background as seemed to fit in those stories. And I always have had an interest in both history and journalism. I look for good stories where I can tell them.
Absolutely. Yeah. I have to ask too, I was doing some homework for this and I found an old interview with Charlie Rose, which I think was also from 1995. And it kind of made me wonder, was it easier to write that book with the amount of access you had compared to what Alice Schroeder got, about a decade and change 12 years later, or was it harder?
I presume she had a lot more access.
She did. Yeah, she had full access. So.
I'll tell you an interesting story. When I wrote the book, I had nothing to compare it by. It was the only Buffett book, full length out there when I did it. It was the only book I'd written anyway. And I asked Warren for cooperation. I didn't even think it would be an issue. I just told him that I had a contract, and I told him the circumstances under which I'd like to see him in his office, his home, on the road, meetings, and so on. And he wrote me back and said, no, thanks. You're on your own. I was just stunned. But he said something else. He said, this will work better for me, given his schedule and his what he wanted to do and didn't want to do. But he said it would also work better for you, Roger, which gets to your question. And I really think it did, because not so much that I would have been, might have been overwhelmed by whatever he told me, but it freed me to write my book on Warren, and not Warren's book on Warren. So for me, anyway, it worked out very well to have to not make it authorized, even though I had access to all kinds of colleagues and friends of his. Obviously, I had to get the information from someplace.
Right.
But for me, I think it, as he actually suggested, it worked out very well.
Yeah, and one other tidbit from that interview, which I'd never heard before or realized, was that he did all of the post-writing or edit when you were at the editing phase correspondence through Charlie Munger, and Charlie sent you 3 factual corrections, which you made, and then 3 non-factual requests, which you declined. Do you remember what those were?
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't so much editing; it was touch an author's sensitivity, but
Yeah.
in return for permission to quote from his letters, his personal letters.
Oh, I see.
Charlie asked if they could review the manuscript or read the manuscript with no rights, and I said okay,
Sure.
and then he immediately gave permission, and then it was just on me to respond however I chose to whatever their comments were. Remember that one, I think, this is going back, the editing probably would have been in 94, so you're talking 28 years, so don't hold me to any of this, but
Sure.
I seem to remember that when they bought Coke, I had some way of comparing the value of Coke, the amount that they put into Coke, to the value of the corporation then. And I hyped it up a bit in Charlie's view that, I said they were, he was gambling whatever percent. And he said, if you really looked at it, whatever way that looked at it, obviously it was a big bet, but it wasn't quite as much of a gamble as I'd suggested. So I changed that. The others, one was about a description of an intimate in Warren's life, and that one I did not change. It was just how I saw it, and Charlie said they'd rather not see that described that way, and I didn't change that. I
Well,
none of these things were of great,
they weren't of great consequence.
A huge moment, or
just a fascinating footnote to a fantastic book. Like I said, I still give that book to anyone who comes to me and says, hey, I'd love to learn about business or investing, or what's this Warren Buffett fellow up to, or anything like that. I hand it out at the first chance I get. So if there's anyone out there, and I doubt there's a single listener of this podcast that hasn't read that book, but if by chance there's one, I would highly recommend it. So on that note, I'll move on to your new book, Ways and Means About the Civil War. And I have to admit, I wasn't a history major. I love history. I'm not a history buff, but I've read several books about the Civil War, and in reading some of the reviews about this book from actual Civil War scholars, I think it's true that this is actually kind of a novel take on the Civil War. And in having read the book, it's fascinating to me. So for anyone who's unfamiliar, as I was, when the Civil War, when Lincoln was elected and when the Civil War began, we had no ability, the government of the United States had no ability to raise taxes, had no ability to borrow. There was no federal bank. It had been dismantled. There was no federal currency. It was required to deal in gold and silver. And, paper money was referred to as a blasphemy at that time. There was no such thing as legal tender. There were just bank IOUs issued by dozens or hundreds of individual banks, and merchants and private citizens could decide to accept them or not. So it's quite fascinating that's where we started. And so I view this book kind of as the ultimate counterfactual. In other words, that without this financing of the Civil War, the South very well might have won. I mean, they've even said, you quoted a couple people in the book as basically saying that they didn't lose the war on the battlefields, they lost the war in the Treasury. Is that a fair takeaway from the book?
I think I think it is a fair takeaway. The South was they were gutsy. They were willing to shed their blood, which they did in copious amounts on the battlefield. They certainly frustrated the North for well into the war. They They kept surprising the North. They made these incursions into Maryland and Pennsylvania, which really scared the jeepers out of the North. But as all that was happening, the North was innovating financially uh, and economically and socially, thanks to Lincoln's agenda. I mean, everything from the things you mentioned, taxes, a currency, a new banking system, to things like a land grant college act. Sending it, permitting everyone to go to college at a time when it was unheard of. To the Transcontinental Railroad, they were creating a modern state and actually prospering. Uh, Immigration was continuing. Immigrants were going out west and digging new mines, and Lincoln was tracking this stuff. He was insistent that the progress of the economy had to go forward, even as the war was being fought. In the meantime, the South, as it was hanging on by its fingernails militarily and winning its share of the battles, it was disintegrating. I was just rereading some of the figures today. A barrel of flour cost $5.50 when the war broke out. 2 years later, in 1863, it cost $38. And by the final months of the war, it cost $1,000. That's pretty vicious inflation. There were, by the end of the war, they weren't printing notes on normal monetary paper anymore. They were printing it on the reverse side of wallpaper. They printed so many notes they'd run out of paper. There were the Richmond papers talked of seeing as a common sight black slaves toting wheelbarrows full of notes, fresh from the stamping press. It became their leading industry. They were willing to tax, unlike the North. I think there's a lesson for today. We've heard so much about modern monetary badness, or whatever it's called. But we obviously have a real inflation issue today. The monetary side is important. The fiscal side is also important. You can't just spend forever without taxing. And they realize that in the North, although, and they invented a whole taxing system. We'd never had an income tax before. We never had any kind of internal taxes. It was all on the tariff. And they created the forerunner of the IRS. It still exists. It's called the Internal Revenue Bureau back then, and a quite involved taxing system. And the South, although they were willing to die for the cause, they weren't willing to be taxed, and their economy just imploded.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, one chart that you put right at the front of the book was about $1 worth of gold and Confederate notes over time, and when in May of 1861, starting at $1, by April of 1865, it was $100 to hammer home again the hyperinflation that took place over that era, which is just astounding. But at least in my reading, it wasn't quite clear as to how much you attribute that hyperinflation and the printing and printing and printing to a total and utter lack of discipline, which seemed to be at least the crux of your allegation. But also, was there just kind of a structural inability for the South to actually impose much in the way of taxes, given the structure of the economy and the aristocracy of planters? And
certainly in part, if you want to tax, you want liquid wealth, because those are the things that can be turned into dollars or whatever the currency is that the central government can use to ship to England to buy arms and the things they needed. And the North had far more factories, more banks and more solvent banks. Anything you think of, they had more commerce, more merchants. So the South had cities too. Anything you think of in terms of liquid wealth, which are more easily taxed, the North had. The South had wealth, but the lion's share of its wealth was in land and slaves. Now, they could have taxed. This whole thing was set up for the wealthy planters. They seceded because the planters felt threatened. They felt that slavery was threatened. Only a quarter of the Southern population had slaves. And the whole thing, the Confederacy, was in their interest, but they were unwilling to be taxed. They were willing to have land and slaves taxed. They basically were unwilling to pay any sort of tax. Willie Sutton said, where you rob money, you go where it is, to the banks. Well, if they were going to tax, it was going to be the planters. And they could have sold off their slaves. They could have sold off land. It would have been hard. The market for slaves wasn't very good once the war started. So it was partly structural, but it was partly just an ideological aversion to taxes, and particularly the federal taxes, and an unwillingness to pay up.
Yeah, interesting.
Also, I'll add, there was a delusion. We're living through, I think, a war brought on in part by the delusion of an autocrat, Vladimir Putin, who thought that his control over energy would allow him to, in effect, walk over the NATO powers or not face any resistance from them. The South had that same sort of delusion. They went around before the war saying cotton is king, as a verbatim quote. No one dares lay a hand on us. They thought that they produced 3/4 of the world's cotton. Cotton was the energy of the 19th century. It was the engine of the Industrial Revolution. A million people or so depended on cotton for their employment in the mill towns of New England and also of Lancashire and also in the mill districts of France. And they really thought that this granted them immunity. And this kind of delusional thinking ultimately trapped them in a war that they had no business of being in.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because you wrote an essay about that on your Substack, which I, of course, would recommend everyone look up and subscribe to, about the parallels between cotton in the South during the Civil War and oil and the conflict in Russia today. But, so the inflation issue we've kind of covered, and you warned pretty clearly that, that was, there are parallels and lessons to be learned there today. But another big theme of the book is that, this was a fight about the definition of money. And it was quite fascinating to read the debates and the pushback that various people had about the concept of issuing legal tender out of the United States and out of the United States central government. And the pushback on moral terms, that it was some sort of moral issue, moral failing, that it was just beyond the imagination. And you wrote several times that it was basically a fight about the definition of money. And so the modern parallel there that jumped out to me was about, some of the stuff we're seeing today in crypto and cryptocurrencies that are being traded. And I keep coming back over and over again that a monetary union, as the glue of the United States in the Civil War and really ever since, is still a key issue. But, it was beyond the scope of the book, but I'm wondering what your thoughts are about crypto as a parallel.
So the moral issue, at the end of the first year, during the first year, 1861, the Union relied on borrowing the private bank's gold. The banks didn't want to give up their gold, lend it. They wanted to lend paper, but Salmon Chase, the Treasury Secretary, didn't. He was a Jacksonian. He was a stickler for coin, and after they lent, just as a side, they lent the first $50 million. They had a celebratory dinner. And at the dinner, the lead banker said, "Mr. Secretary, you got your $50 million. We think that should quite suffice to fight the war." Well, he ended up spending it 60 times over. And needless to say, the banks, they couldn't fight the war on gold anymore because that basically exhausted the banks. So in the beginning of 1862, the Union was facing bankruptcy. They didn't have anything to pay the troops with or their contractors. And a congressman proposed legal tender, which would be paper that would have the legal status of money. Now, there were notes circulating, hundreds and hundreds, as you alluded to. Private banks circulated IOUs, and in a free market, people could take them or not. And what tended to happen was the notes of the best financed Eastern banks, New York, Philly, Boston, were valued at close to par. And the further you got from them, the dicier they got. And as you traveled out of state, you had to take a haircut. That was the financial system or non-system. But these notes were going to be different. They were going to be legal tender, worth par. And there was quite a profound debate in the Congress, even among Republicans who basically supported the Lincoln agenda. Many of them were really viscerally and morally opposed to calling, as one said, Samuel Fessenden, the chair of the Senate Finance Committee, the most powerful financial a legislator in the Congress said, I oppose making anything other than gold or silver a legal tender. Others said it shocked all their notions. The idea that you could, that people who had borrowed in gold would be able to pay it back in paper seemed to them to be a perversion. And they also worried greatly that foreign nations would downgrade us in their estimation and, of course, in their trade. The precious metals were the international standard. In fact, one banker who later became Treasury Secretary said that God Almighty had put gold and silver in the earth to give human beings a standard of value. So this is something they took very seriously, and I think, at least the North, and it's to their credit because although they did put out this money and it was quite successful, people accepted it, they had to accept it, but they really liked it, and they called them Lincoln dollars as a term of affection, but they were careful to limit the amount of greenbacks of this paper. And then the way they were able to do it was because they relied on taxes for much more, and that made up much more of their revenue. And the taxes enabled them to borrow even more, because obviously a government with tax revenue has more credibility and therefore credit than a government with no revenue. You asked about crypto. I think the big difference between crypto and even the greenbacks that the union put out, or the dollars that we put out today, which are essentially the same, is the dollars are backed by tax revenue. So regardless of what you call the currency or how it's denominated, the productive power of the United States stands behind the issuer of those notes. And that's pretty considerable. I don't see anything behind the issuance of crypto. There's no productive power at all. It's just, as far as I can see, a game of greater fool. It's not even like valuing art, which I enjoy looking at. How much time can you spend looking at some of the electrons or something, or whatever it is behind crypto? So I just don't understand crypto.
Right.
And I refer you for more pungent comments to Charlie Munger, who you referred to.
Yeah, I'm sure we've heard and seen a lot of those over the last couple of years. But I wanted to go back.
I do think, Phil, on the crypto, that it should be a reminder to those at the Federal Reserve. Currencies come and go, currency systems come and go. And there's obviously a threat to the credibility of national currencies now. And I think it particularly behooves them to take their role as stewards of the currency, i.e. stewards of the value of the currency, very seriously. If we got into a 1970 situation where the currency was inflating 13 or 15% every year, you might see a real runaway from the dollar, and particularly with these supposed alternatives out there. So I take that.
No, I agree with that part. Yeah, it's a good segue too, because I was going to ask you. You mentioned the reasonable limits, which was a key part of the book, where the government actually self-limited themselves in the issuance of the greenbacks to 1/6 of the total war debt, and that actually proved to be a boon to America's credit and kind of the exercise of nation making, as you called it, that was Lincoln's ultimate purpose. And so they were able to show this self-discipline. And then a related thought that I thought was really powerful was that you mentioned, or you wrote, that finance is always the act of planning for the worst. And so along those two lines, have reasonable limits and the act of planning for the worst in the financial sense, have those ideas been lost recently, both in society and in the government in particular in the US?
Well, I think somewhat, thankfully or not, the worst tends to roll around sooner than we expect. So people get religion again. I guess the Fed is meeting more or less right now as we speak. It'll be interesting to see what they do. But there was a long period over the last year where it seemed to me that with rates at 0%, the risk that rates would be too low and too stimulative was far greater than the risk that they would be too high, that the policy would be too contractionary. So I think the Fed got a little too optimistic, and a little too optimistic about this idea that the inflation, as it developed and continued and persisted, was going to be transitory. The people always people tend to wait for normal to come back, but after some big event, normal is really the same. The world wasn't the same after September 11th. It's not going to be the same after the Putin war on Ukraine, however it ends. And after having had a period of massive stipulation, which I think was necessary at the onset of COVID, and massive federal spending, it's just unlikely that the world was going to go back to exactly where it was, whatever happened to supply chain bottlenecks. So once the immediate economic need passed, and the economy began to return, which it did quite quickly after several months in the pandemic. I made the point before, this was not primarily a financial crash in origins or in character the way the 2008 mortgage crash was. That was, you had millions of Americans deep in debt. They weren't going to be spending for a long, long time. They were going to be trying to dig their way out of being overborrowed. So in financial terms, you needed some sort of stimulus for quite a while. At least we weren't going to overheat for a long time. In fact, we really never did. But this time was different. This time, meaning the COVID caused financial episode, it was caused by a bug, by a virus. It wasn't economic or financial in origin. So once we figured out a way to get people back at work, which we did pretty quickly, and the stimulus checks were absolutely needed in that interim. But once that period passed, I'm surprised that the Fed didn't start to get back towards more normal interest rate.
And do you think this period overall, this is a bit of a digression, but you wrote or said in a related interview about Origins of the Crash that the wrongdoing of the 1990s was greater than that of the 1920s. They both had a love affair with stocks and a lot of speculation and a total embrace of new technology, a lot of which proved useful, but it was just way, way overdone. And it ultimately ended up in a rejection of kind of the earlier progressive and liberal schemes. Do you think that is true? I mean, as I look at the last, call it 2 years, some of the speculations and frenzied behavior we've seen in markets are hard to reconcile with any other prior period.
Well, there's nothing wrong with speculation. Somebody once said, might have been my father, that if there was no speculation, there wouldn't have been any railroads. That's not to say that the government should encourage it or reward it, but it's a human, it flows from the human spirit. The wrongdoing I was referring to in that book about 2000 and the early 2000s, if I remember correctly, was the criminal wrongdoing, were the games and worse that companies like Enron and MCI WorldCom, and although they didn't get indicted, Lucent and Xerox and Rite Aid and quite a few more were playing, under the tutelage of the also unindicted managers at places like General Electric, where so-called managing your earnings became actually admired, and a terrible phrase, managing your earnings. How about just reporting your earnings? None other than George Bush, the president, said that finally had to say the business pages of American newspapers shouldn't look like a scandal sheet, which is exactly what they'd become. And I think that, to me, that era should be I guess because the dot-com bubble has become, synonymous with the bubble of our age and it's sort of the tulip bubble of our time. And companies like Pets.com, are fun to remember and talk about. We've lost sight of absolutely how irresponsible corporate America and their accountants, remember Arthur Andersen, and many of their lawyers, and other handholders and enablers were. And that's the wrongdoing I was referring to. You've had some of that this time around. Obviously, you had Theranos, which was a criminal enterprise, but I don't think you've had it in the same degree by any means. I think part of the reason, we passed a very good reform. It's not always spoken of so highly, but the Sarbanes-Oxley law was very good, and it had a clause that every CEO and CFO is to sign off on the accuracy of the financial statements. And I think since then, CEOs have been less likely to play games with the numbers overtly and in ways that would land them at the big house. I think that's going to change for the better. Interesting.
And speaking of playing games and dealing with authority, another thing, going back to the Ways and Means book, is it strikes me that our agrarian roots are probably responsible for a lot of this, but America's distrust of centralized power and distrust of big government goes back right to the founding, right? And it was a key part of the South's, attitude and then financing or failure to finance itself during the Civil War. Do you agree with that, Reed? And what does that imply for the fights that we're having today about how to handle ourselves in Washington?
Absolutely. If you talk to say Europeans, they're astonished that we don't have a national health care. It's not even controversial to them. Everyone needs health care. You don't need 50 systems, or we have 50 systems of state and corporation. And this goes back to actually the Revolutionary War. We gained our political independence by rebelling against the central power, the English king, and the original political framework was designed to avoid anything central, the Articles of Confederation. When they first, during the Civil War, when they realized they needed a real tax base and proposed a real tax system with bite, some of them wanted to leave collection to the states, which, by the way, the individual states, which is what the South did, and none of them collected the meager taxes that they had. But Thaddeus Stevens, who was a very cutting and sarcastic and rather brilliant representative, pointed out that, as he said, it was because of this original defect, the lack of a central taxing power, that the Articles of Confederation were ditched and the Constitution was framed, the Constitution that they were then fighting to defend. He said, we need because at that time, the federal government was at the mercy financially of the states. He said, we need a federal taxing power, but it's continued to be part of the political culture of the United States, the tension between the interior, the mid-country, the South, the Southwest, and the West, and the East Coast, where the universities and the elites and the financial elites are based. That's just a part of the political culture of the country. You mentioned farming, and it reminds me of one of the early bills they passed. It was really a standout because Lincoln created the Department of Agriculture, which may sound like just a sort of bureaucracy and not very interesting, but it was the first department that dealt specifically with the private sector. That dealt, of course, with the largest sector of the economy, agriculture. Lincoln was very excited about it because he knew, and the department was formed with very modest goals to spread seeds and farming know-how to farmers. Lincoln was very excited because, being a Westerner, he knew how difficult it was to farm on the frontier. He knew that the farmers out there were greater distances between each other. They didn't have access to farming materials and seeds and know-how. They were just spaced further apart than farmers in New England or Pennsylvania or New York. He called it the People's Department because he thought it would be a department that would interact with individual farmers and do what he thought the purpose of government was, which was to promote opportunity within the private sector. What's so interesting about it is that Jefferson Davis also had an opinion on the Department of Agriculture. Jefferson Davis, of course, the president of the Confederacy. Davis was also born in Kentucky, about 100 miles from where Lincoln was born, just a year earlier, also in a log cabin. But his family moved down south. They became wealthy planters. And Davis then went into the U.S. Senate. His brother, by the way, started him out in farming by giving him a cotton plantation. So when the idea of a Department of Agriculture first began to kick around in the late 1850s, shortly before the war, Davis, as senator from Mississippi, helped to squelch it. And what he said was, agriculture needs no teaching by Congress. Well, that was true if your brother had given you a free cotton plantation. And that was the idea of the South. They didn't want any sort of government that they, the wealthy planters, didn't need. Partly because they didn't want a federal government that would perhaps gain the power to emancipate the slaves, but also very much because they were afraid of raising the expectations of the poor whites who were the majority. There was a governor of Virginia there way before the Civil War who said, "I thank God we don't have free public schools in Virginia, and I pray that we shall not for 100 years." This was a very different philosophy, just a counter-opposite philosophy from that of someone like Lincoln, who went into politics in 1832 when he was 23 years old with the idea that it could help, as he put it, every man to get the chance.
Well, I know we're bumping up against the time limit here shortly, so maybe that's a good last question for me to close with then is, where do you shake out on the great man theory of history, as it were? Would you agree that with no Lincoln, the North doesn't win the Civil War? And as an important derivative related to your book, with no Lincoln, you don't get Chase, who you seem to think was very uniquely suited to be Secretary of the Treasury during this period, and potentially without him, there's no Union victory in the Civil War as well.
Yeah, hard to do the counterfactuals, but Chase was a great secretary, and Lincoln was not only a great president, he was just a great man. That it was such a blessing to have him at a time of that kind of crisis. I'll just share with you one anecdote from way before the war. He served one term in Congress, his only time in the national stage, before he became president. In 1947, he was a not important legislator in the Congress, representing, of course, Illinois. And he proposed an infrastructure bill. Infrastructure was very important to Lincoln. Roads, canals, later railroads. And this is a bill this was that type of bill. A Democrat on the other side simply excoriated it. He cut it up. This is the worst bill ever. How dare Lincoln propose it, and so on and so on. And when he was finished, Lincoln didn't defend the bill or himself. He just said, so modestly, he said, most things, especially of government policy, aren't all good or all evil. Most are a compound of good and evil. We're just looking for things with more good in them than evil. That type of humility and stoicism and patience and wisdom doesn't come around very often. We're lucky to have him then.
Sure. Well, listen, Roger, I want to thank you for coming on and sharing your time with us here. I've been looking forward to this conversation for a long time. In full disclosure, I'm just an unabashed fan of your work. I bought this book with my own money. I've spent hundreds of dollars buying your books for anyone that would take the time to read them. So congratulations again on this, and thank you for joining us.
Phil, it's been a pleasure talking to you as always.
Thanks again. Take care.
Thank you for listening to This Week in Intelligent Investing, brought to you exclusively by MOI Global, the research-driven membership organization. Learn more at moiglobal.com.